Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar for the Urban Forest Plan this evening. My name is Svantje Bubritsky. I'm a Senior Engagement Advisor at Christchurch City Council and I'll be your host for tonight. So thank you for joining us online and hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation, learn something new and also get a few of your questions answered along the way. So a bit of an agenda to start out with. You will see on the screen what we're going to be covering tonight. But before we get into the content, I'll first will introduce the team behind the screen to you. And then I'll let you know how you can participate in tonight's session. And ultimately, I'll hand over to the presenters who will take you through the content and give you an overview of the Urban Forest Plan. So tonight you'll be hearing from Toby Chapman, our city arborist, and Andrew Rutledge, the head of parks at Christchurch City Council. They are our subject matter experts when it comes to the Urban Forest Plan. And we also have my colleague Kieran helping behind the scenes and working really hard to make sure everything is going smoothly in terms of the technology so we can keep moving along. So you will notice that your mics and cameras are switched off, and that's so that we can keep the session moving along. But we're really keen to hear your questions and like you to participate in that way. And so you can either do that by using the question and answer function of Microsoft Teams, which you can see in the top menu bar, or if that's not working for you, you're also welcome to use the chat function in Microsoft Teams. Again, that's in the menu bar. If you're dialing in from a mobile device, you might find those functions by tapping the three dots that are on top of the more sign and should be able to get into those chats. If you are not able to use any of those, lastly, you can email us. So you'll see the email address there. Just send an email to engagement@ccc.govt.nz and we'll get your question that way and make sure we either get it answered tonight or after the webinar. If you are hard of hearing or are experiencing sound issues during the session, you can turn on live captions to follow along that way. In order to do that, again, just click on the three dots on the top menu bar on Teams and then turn on live captions near the bottom of the drop-down list. And now it's just one last thing from me. Hopefully you would have seen as you dialed in, a banner came up to let you know that we are recording this session. And that recording will then be shared on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So you can go back and rewatch it or share it with other people. You'll also receive an email showing you how to access the recording along with a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we'll be using for tonight's presentation. That's all from me for now, and I'll now hand over to Toby Chapman, who will take us and make a start on the presentation. Enjoy, everyone.
Thanks, Svantje, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming and hearing a bit more about the Urban Forest Plan. So first of all, I thought we'd just start with what is an urban forest. So it may be a relatively new term to some of you, and some of you will be familiar with the term. So an urban forest is a way of looking at all of the trees and vegetation within an urban environment and treating it as a forest. So it's looking at the collective of all of the trees. So it includes park trees, it includes street trees, rooftop gardens, trees on private land. So all of those trees, and when we start thinking them as a whole, we start looking at them as a collective and seeing them more as a forest. So around the world, urban forests are being seen more and more for the importance that they provide, the importance of them to urban environments. They're being considered more and more as critical infrastructure, so as something that we need to have in our urban environments as opposed to a nice to have. The reason for this is because of the many benefits that trees provide. So a lot of those benefits that come from trees, particularly in urban environments, help to offset some of the effects of us living in those urban environments. They help improve water quality through filtration of water and also reducing sedimentation through holding banks and reducing impact from rain. They improve air quality through taking harmful particles out of the air, and also providing shading as well, which reduces the release of volatile organic gases. They sequester carbon, they support biodiversity, so they provide food, they provide habitat, and they provide movement corridors as well. They mitigate urban heat islands, so that's a big thing, particularly when we get those days that are over 30 degrees, which seem to be occurring more and more often. Recently, we took some figures where we looked at areas, particularly of hard surfaces, so pavement, and where we took measurements in open, so full sun, the pavement was getting mid-50s. And then when we went under trees, it was at least 20 degrees cooler. And the same with vehicles as well. So we looked at vehicles parked in the sun, and then we looked at vehicles parked in the shade, and there's at least a 20-degree difference, which most of us will know on a hot day, you go and shelter under a tree because it's a lot cooler. It's just nice to put some figures to that. We also know trees improve our physical and mental health. The feeling we get from being around trees is often good for our mental health. This is an image of some of the development that occurs within the city. So it's looking at what we've called here low quality development, where we go in and we remove all the trees. And you'll see the quote there from Bill Vaughan. Suburbia is where the developer bulldozes out all the trees, then names the streets after them. So this is a development that happened near the university. You can see before where there was a lot of big mature trees and a lot of canopy. And then afterwards, as part of the development, the first thing that was done was to take all the trees down. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, and I'll be back later to talk a bit more about the plan.
Thanks, Toby. Kia ora, everyone. It's a good segue out of that last slide where I guess we're all aware of intensification that's going on around a lot of New Zealand urban environments at the moment. But I guess in our hearts and minds in Christchurch, you know, we think we live in a pretty cool place, a lot of trees around. We all sort of feel like we live in Hagley Park because it's such an important space, and when we walk around Hagley Park, it creates this sense of well-being that we all have. But the reality is our tree canopy coverage is one of the lowest in New Zealand and Australasia. So we've got some work to do. And this is just yet another example that's sort of obviously a little bit further developed than the one Toby showed you earlier. We're right over the road from Hagley Park. You can see, particularly in the left-hand side of that screen, some pretty intense housing development there. A lot of paving and very little, if any, space for any meaningful tree canopy coverage. A lot of the other things that are floating around at the moment, you know, there's campaigns out there for Christchurch should be a national park city. Other people think we should be a biophilic city, which is a variation on national park cities, or there's another one called a green city. And when you look at those charters, they're all essentially driving at the same approach, I guess. And I guess my point of view that certainly I've been talking to my team about is that could be a bit risky for us. We're not in good shape. We need to do better. And if we label ourselves as a national park city, people might get the impression that we're okay when we're not okay. We do need to improve how we develop our city going forward. I'm going to hand back to Toby now, who's going to, who's going to sort of talk you through the plan itself that's out in front of everyone at the moment for feedback.
Thank you, Andrew. So the urban forest plan, what is it? So our plan is there to provide a roadmap for how we can maximise the size of our urban forest, so how we can increase the size of it, how we can get more canopy cover. Not only that, how can we ensure that it is healthy, resilient and lasts? And also, how can we make it uniquely Ötautahi and Te Pātaka o Rakaihotu, Banks Peninsula and Christchurch? So the plan's been in development for a while now. We've had lots of feedback and we've had lots of collaboration. So we've worked with mana whenua, we've worked across councils, so different units. We've had external experts, we've had horticultural professionals, ecologists, and tertiary institutions. It's important to note that the plan covers both public and private land, and it also covers Christchurch and the Banks Peninsula. So what are the goals in the plan? So we've kind of got four main goals. So to plant, nurture, protect, and evolve. So planting is how do we grow and increase the size of our urban forest? Nurture is how do we look after what we've got and what we plant, and how do we ensure that our urban forest is healthy, diverse, and resilient? How do we protect it? So protection can come in a number of forms, which we'll talk about a bit later. And how do we get people involved? So our urban forest is distributed across public and private land. So we need to ensure that it's an urban forest that everyone can be involved in. We're all urban forest managers. So council have undertaken 2 canopy cover surveys, which is using aerial photography and LiDAR to determine how much of our city is covered in canopy. Now, these surveys have shown that it's been decreasing over time. So the first one was done in 2015, 2016, and the next one was done in 2018, 2019 aerial data. So we do it at the same time that we do the flyovers. So when we get the next flyover, then we can do the next one. Now, what that showed, it showed there's areas with low canopy cover and areas with higher canopy cover. So our distribution isn't even across the city. And as you'll see on the image on the left, there's quite a lot of areas in orange and in red where we've actually got quite low canopy cover. So it shows we've got quite a bit of work to do. This area here is an area that you can see on the map is red, and it's an area that was recently developed. So for one reason, one of the reasons that the canopy cover is low is the trees have only just been planted, so they'll take a little bit of time to get bigger. But you'll also see that the intensity of the development is quite high, and there's little space around a lot of these buildings to have the large mature trees. And if we look at an older area, so this is in Kashmir area, we will see a lot of the mature trees there dotted around the place, and the canopy cover is relatively high in this area. You'll see that the properties, there's space for trees around them. So in these areas, we've got canopy that's existing, so it's important we try and retain that and acknowledge that when those areas are developed, how do we develop in a way that we can keep what is there? So within the plan, we have targets, canopy cover targets. So canopy cover is a measure of an area that is the percentage of an area that is covered by vegetation. And for the purpose of our canopy cover, we look at anything that's over 3.5 metres tall. What you'll see is the small numbers show what's existing, and the larger numbers show what the target is for the urban forest plan, where we're trying to get to. So when we developed these targets, we looked at the land type and the way it's used and its capacity to have trees. So you'll see areas like open spaces have a greater capacity to support trees, hence the higher target. We looked at what the existing canopy cover was, and we also looked at targets across other cities around the world. So when we start looking at the goals, the first one, goal 1 is plant. So urban forest canopy is growing sustainably. So this is about looking at how we can increase the size of our canopy, of our urban forest. So we want to grow our urban forest to achieve the canopy cover targets that we saw in the previous slide. We want to ensure that that canopy is equally distributed across the city. A lot of the benefits that we get from trees are location specific. So the closer you are to the tree, the more of that benefit you will generally get. So we want to ensure that those benefits are distributed to everyone. We need to prioritise those lower coverage areas. And we also need to look at Banks Peninsula in a special way. So Banks Peninsula is unique compared to Christchurch, where Christchurch is largely urban. When we get to the Banks Peninsula, we've got these pockets of urban areas, but we've also got a large area of that which is rural land, and we need to do some work on finding a way that best suits that rural land. Goal 2, nurture. So our urban forest thrives with healthy, diverse and resilient trees. So this is focused on not only increasing the size of our urban forest, but how do we ensure that it is healthy and resilient? How do we make sure that it is well suited to our changing climate? Making sure that trees are healthy, have the space to grow. Having a good resilience comes from diversity of different species. And then things like increasing the visibility of our native species and creating ecological corridors to allow the movement of wildlife. Goal 3, protect. Our urban trees are valued and looked after as critical infrastructure. Often when we talk about protection, we first think of the district plan and having trees protected under significant trees, but protection comes in a lot of other forms as well. Firstly, by ensuring that trees are seen as critical infrastructure, as something we need to have, as opposed to something that's a nice to have. By doing that, we can ensure that we retain what we've got, but we also make sure that we plant more during development. The way we maintain trees to ensure that we can extend their life. So a healthy tree will live longer, which means our canopy is protected for longer as well. And then also with the district plan and other regulatory measures and how we can ensure that we protect trees in that form as well. And lastly, goal 4, involve. So urban forest is nurtured by partnerships and participation. So a lot of our land is not council land or Crown land, so it's on private landowners. So it's important to ensure that anything that we do towards moving towards a bigger and healthier canopy cover or urban forests is supported and has public participation. We want to encourage communities to actively participate in the protection and the development of our urban forests. We want partners, so papatipu, runanga, citizens organisations, communities that are already contributing to our thriving urban forests. We want to engage with them and work with them. And trees are often a source of celebration for many cultures, so we want to make sure we reflect that as well. So how long will it take? So the target for our urban forests canopy cover targets are based on 50 years. The reason they're based on 50 years is trees take a long time to grow. We want to make sure that when we're planting the trees, we're giving them the space to grow to become mature canopies. And that's how and when we will start to see that proper growth in the size of our canopy cover. Once adopted, the plan will need resourcing, and that'll come through the council's long-term plan. So what are some of the challenges? We know what we want to get, but what's holding us back or making it difficult? So finding space is one of the biggest challenges. So as we intensify, we leave little space to support big mature trees. We also don't see them as critical infrastructure. Again, we see them as a nice to have. Our changing climate. As our climate gets hotter, some species won't be well suited to that climate. So we need to pick species that will survive now and in the future. And conflicts. So ensure trees are planted in locations that don't cause excessive shading. We need to ensure that we've got a positive perception of trees. It's largely, most people do like trees, but it's making sure that they all see the benefits and understand them.
No.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to hand over to Andrew now. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. So implementing the plan is obviously a critical action that we need to take. Often plans are written, some of them gather dust on the shelves, but this one's far too important for that. We need to get this implementation moving. We hear these things a lot in council. We get quite a few customer service requests relating to trees. These are just some of the things we hear. And I think, we can all relate to this. The first one, I love trees, but not that one there. I can put my hand on my heart and say there's a tree next door that really annoys me at certain times of the year, but I'll tell you what, boy, did we need that tree a couple of weeks ago. It was an absolute respite. So a lot of people have different points of view around trees, so we're very mindful of this, and we need to come up with an effective implementation plan. So I'm just going to talk you through some of that now. The initial idea that we've come up with, and this is something that we floated with community boards and with elected members who often hear from people directly about trees, is to use what we're calling a light recession plane model. And what that does is very similar to a building going up in an empty lot or next door to you, or somebody's adding something to their building. We're going to use tools that look at putting the right tree in the right place and focused on its mature scale and size, so that we're not handing something on in 5 or 10 or 15 years that somebody wants to remove. So the recession plane model essentially is outlined here, and I'll give you a little bit of time to sort of understand this, but essentially what we've done is we've looked at a few parks around the city, and we've chosen what we believe to be the more difficult parks to get trees into the right place once they're mature. We've got an external recession plane, which might be a road or it might be a property boundary. And we've got internal recession planes too, like sports fields that need light to be able to provide the service that they need to provide. And you can see in all the different cross sections around the northeast, west and south, what that might look like. So for example, cross section AA, which is right on a property boundary, right up near the boundary, we'll be planting smaller trees through to larger trees further away from the property. But if you look at cross section C, for example, the red line indicates where the nearest property is. And we can plant larger trees right up to that road boundary in parks. So, so you can get the benefits of having those majestic, larger trees in the environment as well. Thank you. And there's just another view looking into the park itself and property boundaries and so forth. So taking this sort of recession plane modelling forward will give us a bit more confidence that the tree is going to reach that mature state that Toby talks about. And what we can do once we've got those trees plotted is we can run shade modelling. So if you look at that park, it's very small, sorry, but you've got 8 a.m, I think it is, in the top left, right through to 8 or 6 p.m. And you can see that in summer, obviously the shading is not too impactful on either the park or the neighbours. And then we can flick to the next slide. We'll see the winter solstice, when we really start to look at the 10 a.m. through to 4 p.m. And you can start to see some of the shading and the impacts of the shading that planting, and this is done on the mature height, would have on the surrounding environments. So it's a way of creating, I guess, a little bit of confidence in the community that we're not going to just go running in there and plant large trees on their boundary, that in 15 or 20 years their houses are going to be fully shaded. When we look at that, it also gives us the opportunity with these models to think about how we measure what we're achieving going forward. It's a long time to wait 50 years to do a measure to see if you're getting it right or not. So we need some metrics, if you like, to be able to have confidence of what we're achieving or not, as the case may be. In the park that we're showing there, there's 121 existing trees, 19% canopy cover, and you will perhaps recall from one of Toby's earlier slides, we want to try and achieve 40% where we can in public spaces. We can fit, using that recession plane modelling, another 128 trees into that park environment without impacting on the key activities. and that will take that canopy cover up to about 35% for this park. Now, so some of these more trickier parks, like sports parks, we're not likely to hit 40%, but we can offset that in other parklands and larger parklands where we can increase the amount of canopy coverage ultimately. We've looked at 6 parks, one for each community board at the moment, to enable us to have conversations with the community board. They're going to be instrumental in ensuring that we get a good canopy urban forest out there in the community, where we've run these models, and they'll probably form the first trial that we'll do this year. We can put over 1,000 trees into these 6 parks. We are investing in increasing the propagation capacity of the council's nurseries. We'll be looking outside our own nursery as well. We really need, we're planting sort of in the high hundreds at the moment per annum. We need to get from the high hundreds up towards 10,000 trees per annum over about 3 years. So there's quite a nodal shift is required to get this urban forest into the shape it needs to be in. We get a lot of questions, or I guess people look at things like the river corridor and think, well, you know, we've got that red zone land that gives us a wonderful opportunity. It does give us a wonderful biodiversity opportunity, but it's predominantly wetland. Of the 660 hectares, only about 15 to 20% is really suitable for it to sustain a good quality urban forest, and particularly important in that space that it's predominantly native species. And that adds about 2% canopy cover across the city. Sorry, that was a 0.2%, not 2%. The Port Hills is another area that people talk about a lot, and I guess those of us that are flatland dwellers look at the Port Hills and go, well, we just need to cover those hills and trees and we'll be right. There's about 420 hectares of Port Hill land available for tree planting. This excludes the peninsula, by the way. And that'll give us about a 1% increase in total canopy coverage. So it is a significant opportunity, but we can't just sit back and think that if we just plonk it up on the hills or out in the red zone, the whole city's going to be okay. As Toby pointed out, it's really important that there's good populations of mature trees where people live. So some of the early feedback in the plan, over 80 submissions, so we're pretty happy with that. There's some themes coming in there, which we're pretty familiar with. More native trees, and don't remove all our exotic trees. And I think it's really important that we have balance as we go forward. The 2 different types of trees provide different outcomes, and I don't see us moving away from the current situation where we've got a reasonable balance of both native and exotic. It's an interesting one there. The target should be achieved sooner. It's quite complex and difficult to plant a lot of trees and actually keep them alive. It's also got to be done in a really careful and well-planned manner, because otherwise we're going to be handing a massive financial burden onto our ratepayers of the future if we dramatically increase our urban forest, but they're not planted well, they're not nurtured well in their early life, and we hand a major maintenance problem off into the future. So we've got to be very mindful of that as well. And protection of trees during development. There is work going on with the district plan change at the moment, and this is a particularly important topic that's being looked into. And just so it doesn't sound like we're, it's too much doom and gloom, but, there's a lot of people that are active out there at the moment. We have community partnership rangers in our parks team that are connecting with communities, people that want to get involved and get into their local environment and make a difference. And this is just one example. David Newton, a secondary school teacher, started this program in 2017, and he's got 20 to 30 odd schools engaged now. We've got teenage kids who are particularly challenging to try and get motivated sometimes. But they're propagating trees and planting those trees, predominantly around the fringes of the red zone. So there is some really good work that's going on that's going to help our urban forests into the future. So that pretty much wraps up the presentation. And if any questions pop up on the screen or whatever, we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you both, Toby and Andrew, for this presentation and giving us a really good rundown on the urban forest plan. Do we have any questions? Yeah, unfortunately, we aren't able to receive your questions via voice. So if you do have questions, please just write them into the chat, either in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and then we'll read them out for everyone and can get them answered. We do have someone typing away there, so just give it a moment and see what the question is. So the question is around that the targets seem quite low and whether we feel that that's ambitious enough. I'll just get Toby to reply to that.
So we tried to, when we looked at what those targets should be, we looked at the capacity that we have for growing those, and we looked at other cities and what their canopy cover is and what their targets were to get a balanced approach to it. We wanted to find a way to ensure that we can still live in our city and have a healthy canopy cover. If we're referring to the targets in that table 1 in the shorter term, that's reflecting that trees take time to grow. So you'll see, if you look in the urban forest plan, there's 2 targets. There's, I think, by 2030, and then there's onward at the end of the plan, I think in 2070. That first target's quite low because when trees are planted, they're really small. So we need time for them to mature and get bigger.
So the first trees will be planted this planting season, which kind of kicks off usually around the end of March. So we're definitely ramping up this season from around the sort of hundreds mark that I mentioned up into the thousands. So you will definitely hear of plenty of new trees being planted. And just while I might just pick up that there's a question there about what kind of trees we intend to plant and would that include fruit and nut trees, and I'll just touch on that. There's no reason why we can't. We want to work with our local communities, and that's what our community partnership rangers will be doing, is putting notices out to people and going, you know, are you interested in getting involved? But also, what is the suite of trees that you would like to see, you know, in the communities that you live in? So there's absolutely opportunities for that. We do need to be mindful, though, that fruit and nut trees can come with pest-related problems, and that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing that. We just we'll be working very closely with the communities to make sure that's actually what they would like to see. Maybe I'll hand back to you on question number.
Thank you, Andrew. So we've got a few more questions rolling in. So we've got I've noticed many of the existing street trees are in poor health, not thriving. Can more be done to nurture the health of these trees? Absolutely. Good tree management is one of the key parts of goal 2, so nurturing trees, trying to make sure that they're healthy and thriving. So looking at our existing trees, it's continuing to maintain them, but then also looking at when we plant new trees, how do we ensure that they've got the space to grow through to maturity, and particularly in our street environment, which is a very challenging environment, choosing species that are well suited to that sort of environment and will thrive there as well. Another question, what are the plans for Banks Peninsula on rural land? So within the urban forest plan, we talk about developing more suitable targets and plans for rural Banks Peninsula, and that'll be working with groups that are already doing work out there as well to develop what is best suited for that type of land. Next one, can you talk some more about plans for integrating the urban forest in the urban development space? And trees be required to remain, and protection around soil structure, etc. So there's Plan Change 14, which is currently out. There's more of that coming, and that's talking about looking at how we can ensure when there's development, we can try and retain 20% canopy cover or plant 20% canopy cover, or where they can't, how they can contribute through a financial contribution for us to plant and offset that loss elsewhere. So there is work going on in this space, and it is a big part of the plan and something that a lot of people are concerned about. Just going through. I'll hand over to Andrew for the next question.
Thanks, Toby. Oh, I just got a bit of feedback there. Okay, so we've got someone, it looks like someone in our parks team's joined the webinar, so that's fantastic. And essentially their question relates to, I guess, the population of pest plants that exist throughout the city and the challenges that we have with managing pest plants, some of which are definitely are, grow into trees. How are we going to ensure that we can manage this urban forest? Well, Council has approved the implementation of a dedicated planting team for the urban forest. It's a relatively small team initially, but that team will be responsible for propagation, nurturing, planting, and all the formative pruning work for the tree for the first 5 to 7 years of its life. And that's to ensure that we get the best outcome we can and we're not handing on too much of an issue for the future. In terms of pest trees or pest plants, it will be a gradual process, but there's definitely will be a focus on how we can best manage those. There's another question there, which is about, will there be public plantings like at Horseshoe Lake Road last year? Absolutely, we want to see more and more public plantings, particularly in our urban parks. We really want local communities to take ownership of their urban forest, and that's something that we'll be promoting quite strongly. And Toby's got the next question. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. So the next question, what emphasis is given to native biodiversity in the plan? So there is targets around increasing the visibility and forest patch configuration for native trees to help support native biodiversity. So if we looked at our nursery numbers, we plant a large majority of the trees that go out are generally native, but they're in restoration planting and those green corridors and along river corridors and things like that. But where we don't see as many natives is in our urban parks and streets. So we've got a target in there to try and increase the visibility to ensure that there's trees planted in those sorts of locations. The forest patch configuration is looking at how far wildlife can move and making sure that we've got patches of forest and within close enough proximity to allow movement of that native wildlife. Next one, how will you create incentives for developers to work around established trees rather than cutting them down? Good question. So This is something we're working hard with the planning team on. So that we mentioned just before about the financial contribution. So having requirements for a certain amount of canopy cover during development. So if there's already trees there, it would be in there. It would be incentivized for them to retain them to reduce them having to plant or pay financial contributions. And I will hand over to Andrew.
Thanks. So there's a question there that relates back to that implementation model, really, which is how much say will residents have in declining tree plantings outside their properties? Now, I'm not sure if you're referring to the street environment or boundaries with parks and so forth, but I guess it's essentially the same. Look, people's points of views are taken into account, but that doesn't change the fact that we do need to reach some goals and targets, and that's where the right tree, right place is the way that we would like to approach that, by having conversations with residents in particular that have concerns to see if we can't curb some of those concerns going forward. Now, typically the kind of concerns we hear about are when tree fed leaves that can impact on properties, or another one that we hear a lot about in Christchurch is trees damaging footpaths. Going forward, and there's no doubt that there's conflicts, but going forward, we are looking at different techniques to mitigate as much of that conflict as we can. So there definitely will be opportunity for people to have their say. And back to Toby.
And Andrew. So next question, will Canterbury's natural heritage, i.e. the plants that occupied Canterbury prior to human development, be respected and taken into consideration? Yes, we will take this into consideration. So another big part of the plan is choosing species that suit their local environment, and that will be one of the things that will be considered. Next question. Many new roads have included trees, however many have not, which is a missed opportunity. Moving forward, can we expect trees to be a priority in all new road developments? Can we intensify the density in which these are being planted? So this is a key focus of the plan, and this comes down to seeing trees as critical infrastructure as opposed to nice to have. So once we start to see trees as something we have to have, we'll see new roads and any new development incorporate trees, just like they do with footpaths, parking spaces, lighting, and other critical infrastructure.
Might just add something.
Hold on, just got to mute.
I'll just add something to that, Toby, too, that was illustrated but not touched on too deeply. Toby talked about the temperature that we see on streets without trees providing shade, and there's quite a stark contrast between the heat on the tar seal, on the tarmac, in a street with no trees compared to a street with trees. There's a lot of financial benefits come from that for the city and the ratepayers, because quite frankly, and there's good evidence around the world on this, that the streets last longer when they're shaded. So there's no question we've got to get the balance right. We've got to do better with how we get the trees into that street environment and make sure that they don't damage other parts of the infrastructure network, but provide the benefits. But there's plenty to work with there.
Thanks, Andrew. So we've got another question here. Given the long-term scale of this plan and the need for Christchurch to boost housing density, is the possibility of a large increase in multi-storey development or replacement of existing properties with taller structures being taken into account with the plan? Yes, absolutely. We've talked with architects, we've talked with planners across council. We can have both. It's about planning for it and designing around it. There are bigger cities with higher density, with higher canopy cover. So it absolutely can be done. It's just got to be one of those priorities that we choose that we want to see in our future.
Thank you for the questions and answers thus far. We still have 10 more minutes left, and I see there's a few more people typing. So we'll still allow for a few more questions and might be able to fill up the time till 7. Just give it a moment there.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question that's come in. And from someone who's just been in Canada for the past year, where trees are highly regulated and pretty much can't be cut down. The climate is exceptionally cold there also, but people tend to live amongst the trees. And the question is, do you think we are giving residents too much say and placing unnecessary restrictions on ourselves by doing the shading overlay? It's a really, really good question. But I guess what we've experienced up to this point is that it's quite challenging to convince people that things are going to be okay when there's mass planting plans put out, when we don't have a mechanism to engage in a conversation. And that's what that model is there for, is to have those conversations with local communities and work out what's going to work and how we get the balance. So there's no really sort of straight answer to that question other than that's what the model is for. It's to get people engaged and willing, and hopefully willing to work with us and talk to us about how we can do better with our urban forest. I'll just pass back to Toby for another question.
Thanks, Andrew. So next question, you mentioned the other ways trees are protected rather than heritage trees. Can you speak to this, please? Yeah. Absolutely. So what I was getting at there is protection is around essentially having something there for longer. Protection is never going to keep something there forever, but it's ensuring that we retain what is there for longer. So what I meant by there's more ways. So if we start treating trees as critical infrastructure, as must to have, then as we design or develop, we see them as something that we have to have. So we work around them. We make sure that we have tree protection management plans to ensure that we can construct around them without them falling or without them dying or having a negative impact. We also look at the way we manage trees as well. So through proactive early juvenile maintenance and establishment, we retain trees for longer with less structural issues, which means that we have less failures and we lose less trees. By pruning them properly, we ensure that we can live around them so they're retained longer. So it's about extending the life of these trees through maintenance and working around them in the correct way.
We have one question here, which is really good around what residents can do to contribute to this on their private land. So I'll just hand back to Toby for this one.
Thank you. So how can residents engage with, contribute to this plan on their own private land? So absolutely. Our urban forest doesn't stick to public and private land. Trees, we need trees everywhere essentially. So by planting on your private land, then we increase the canopy cover for the city. If we're planting where people can see it, then people get those benefits from seeing a tree. Trees will naturally cool our urban areas as well. Trees help with the movement of biodiversity. They reduce the water impact in the ground, so they reduce sediment. So trees on private land are critical to our urban forest and many of the benefits that come from it. Next one I've got is the time and money spent on removing deciduous and exotic tree leaves, suckers and seedlings is massive each year, and the trees keep growing. Wouldn't it be wise to dramatically cut back on planting more and favour native species? So it comes again down to that diversity of species. So a lot of our yes, we do get leaf fall, and it is one of the things that come from trees, but we also get a lot of benefits from those trees as well. In some areas, we don't want shading through the winter, so while we might get a bit of leaf drop, we will get that sun coming through, so we won't get that frost on pathways. So there are areas that we will want deciduous exotic trees, and there's also that visual element to a lot of our exotic trees with our autumn colour and things like that. I'll hand over to Andrew for the next one.
Thanks, Toby. Yeah, I did mention that you know, there's evidence coming in around the world about the positive impacts that trees have on roads. And the question is, does that mean there will be a focus on adding more canopy cover to sidewalks and roadsides in particular? It's definitely part of the picture, and as Toby pointed out earlier, there was a goal to get 15% canopy coverage in that environment. It's possibly an area where we could do better. You know, it's not everybody's cup of tea having trees in the street environment, but if you ask a lot of residents in this city what are their favourite streets to travel down, they'll often say Linwood Ave, Memorial Ave, and Beeley Ave, and you know, there's decent trees on all of those streets. So people do want to see more streets in that environment. And Toby and I did a presentation to an internal team just last week. They're all designers, landscape architects, and there was very much focus on that, on the criticality of ensuring that we get as many trees as we can successfully into those environments. There's another question here. Can we incentivize planting on private land? The answer is yes. Some cities do. I was with people from Seattle last week who were visiting, and this topic came up. And Toby and I had a quick look actually earlier today. They have an incentivized program that when developers are putting in consents for approval, they have a points-based system whereby they can minimise the cost of development contributions by achieving other positive benefits through planting processes. We just had a quick scan at it, but it's definitely something that we can look to implementing into the future with our planning colleagues on how we can incentivise. And I think that's a really important point, because I think probably most people understand that compliance is a very difficult thing, and it's typically reactive in that, well, the tree's gone. That's why you have to act in a compliance manner. So it's not a very productive way of moving the city forward. So that's something that we will have quite a focus on.
Thank you again for all your questions, and thanks again, Andrew and Toby, in presenting tonight and doing such a good job in answering all those questions. We hope that you found the session worthwhile and got all the information you needed for tonight. We have now reached the end, so if any more questions come through, we'll try to get back to you via email. But we are very, very keen to hear your feedback about the urban forest plan. So head to our Have Your Say page and do a submission. That would be great. And we're also keen to hear your feedback on this webinar. It's a new tool that we've been recently trialing. So we're quite keen to hear from you, whether that's something you'd like us to do more of. And for that purpose, we'll be sending out a survey afterwards. We'd really appreciate if you can take a moment to fill in that survey and let us know what you thought of this webinar. If you would like any further information otherwise, please contact the team with your queries. The details are on the Have Your Say page. And as I said earlier, we'll be in touch over the coming days to share this webinar, the link to it, and any further answers to your questions. Thanks again for making the time to join us tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Tēnā koutou katoa.